So this is Deploy to Mars Part 1. This is a two-part series where we're going to talk about DevOpsy type things and some tooling you can use to make your development life better. Between the two sessions, we're going to do this first part, which is ground support systems. We're going to cover basically ground support. I'm referring to basically anything you're doing locally, and some of the tools you can use and some cool things you can do with Lando and some other tools out there. And then in part 2, which is a session we'll be doing after lunch, right after lunch, we will cover things that you can do with Lando in the cloud and some of the tools you can use to do things that are not on your local machine. Most people think, okay, Lando, that's a local development tool. And that's actually a cloud tool as well. And I'll show you some of that in the next session. But this first section, we'll stick to the local stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and, well, I guess I can introduce myself. I'm Aaron Felity. I have a small dev shop called Arrow One Solutions where I architect out DevOpsy solutions and build out Drupal things. And I've been working with Drupal and this sort of thing for over a decade. And yeah, hoping to just share some of what I know and what I've learned. And actually, most of this presentation is stuff that I'm actively using in active projects. So I'll go ahead and get into it here. I think I can, yes. Okay, so first, what is Lando? Lando is a free open source cross-platform local development environment and DevOps tool built on Docker. So what does all that mean? That means it allows you to mimic your production environment on your own machine. So basically, whatever versions of PHP or MySQL, whatever tools you have running your actual live website, you can mimic those in Docker containers, which are essentially little servers that are easy to download and get set up. Lando allows you to standardize your environment. So you can say, you can define your environment within Lando. Here's all the pieces we need to make it a lot like production. And then you can share that configuration with the rest of your team. And whether they're running Linux, Mac, or Windows, it all runs the same on all of their machines. Lando has integration with hosting providers, so things like Pantheon or Platform.sh or Mazy.io, they have built-in integrations where you can connect Lando to that hosting provider, and then they give you commands to, say, download your database just with Lando. It'll pull it in and copy it into your local environment, and now you have a copy of your production environment right on your local machine. You can customize your tooling. So I mentioned, okay, maybe there's a command to download the database and pull it in. Well, you can write your own as well. You can maybe have, if you have a suite of tests you'd like to run, you can create a command within Lando. So you can type, for example, Lando test in your command line, and it will run whatever tools that you've defined. It allows you to run CI tests locally. So like I mentioned there, your test suite, you can kick it off by typing Lando test if you want. You can also run local tests in CI. So you can actually, this is what I'll get into in the second session after lunch, local tests in CI. So Lando can actually be installed in your CI environment and all automatically and run your tests there. So you can make it part of your deployment process. And, you already have your Lando environment set up. Why bother setting up yet another environment out in the cloud for testing? Just have Lando do it. You can use a single development environment for all of your projects. So basically, instead of switching back and forth between, you have a virtual machine running for this particular site you're working on, and then using the Acquia Dev Desktop, for example, running another website. Lando can run all these things. So you can just have the one, set it up, and you can define your specific needs for each project, and Lando can do all of it. Another thing Lando's pretty good at is it comes prepackaged with XDEBUG, already configured, already set up. If you're not familiar with XDEBUG, it basically lets you step through your code so that you can see what's executing, what your values are for your variables, see how you got to that place in your code through backtraces. And that makes troubleshooting a whole lot easier. I've had some people tell me that they like other ways, but from my perspective, it'll integrate with your IDE like PHP Storm or VS Code, and it will allow you to see what your code is doing right there in your code. Great for troubleshooting, figuring things out. Lando comes with this out of the box. It's a single line in the Lando configuration file. You say XDEBUG on, and you get XDEBUG all configured. It's running. It's working. But that has drawbacks. You get lots of overhead. You get it's processing all of your variables and sending them to your IDE and keeping track of all the stack traces and everything for you. And it's going to slow down your Drupal environment a lot. And if you've used Lando and you felt like it was really slow, there are some issues with Docker and file input output, but a lot of times people just have XDEBUG turned on in their Lando config, and that makes it so that everything's running slow. So if you're not using it, turn it off. But maybe you want to use it. And the problem is, well, if you want to use it, you have to rebuild your environment, and that takes a while. So if you're someone who turns it on, debugs something, shuts it off, that's going to take a lot of time, because every time you turn it on, turn it off, you have to change your config, rebuild Lando. But there's a better way. So here I broke up a Lando file, and here's a snippet from it. So your Lando configuration is your standard, your name. I call this example XDEBUG. It's a Drupal 9 preset, and everything's pre-configured to work Drupal 9. We typically, under this config line, you'd have the web root where you'd say, okay, this is where my Drupal's installed. And then the next line would be XDEBUG, and you'd say true. So XDEBUG true, that would turn it on for your environment. Well, the best way to approach this is to not do that. Leave XDEBUG off by default. Don't put it in your config. Because through Lando's tooling, where we can define our own commands, we can create one called XDEBUG on in this example. We say we want it to work in our app server, which in a Drupal recipe is the PHP Apache server. We describe it. We're saying you're enabling XDEBUG. It's going to run as user root. Root because we're actually going to modify the config inside the environment. And then it's going to execute two commands. The first one is this Docker command that enables XDEBUG. And then the next one will kill PHP FPM or Apache, depending on whether you're running Nginx or Apache in your configuration as your server. This will kill both of them, essentially forcing them to restart and load in now the XDEBUG config. And then I have a message there that set AF2, that's actually coloring it green, so green text in your output there. And you get XDEBUG is now turned on and configured with a single command. So no rebuilding, no changing your config. And then similarly, you have XDEBUG off. Same process, and this time it actually deletes the INI file that got created with the last command, and then restarts either Nginx or Apache, whichever is running. And now there's no more XDEBUG config, so when those start back up, XDEBUG is off. And it's fast. Here's a real-time example. Rather than going to your config and restarting, going to your config, changing the XDEBUG line, rebuilding, which can take, depending on the size of your project, 10, 15 minutes. Just turn it on and off. You can use it when you need it. So when it's off, Drupal runs as fast as it can. When it's on, you have all the debugging tools you need. And actually, I'm going to make it so I can see the chat in case anyone says anything. I think I can put it right here. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Okay, so didn't skip a slide, did I? No. Okay. All right, decoupled. So the concept of decoupled when it comes to Drupal is that you want to separate your concerns between the back end and the front end, or the data management and the actual app that the users encounter. Basically, historically, Drupal is your back end and your front end, right? You can create a theme and it makes everything look great and pretty. But maybe you don't want to use Drupal's rendering. You want to use a React environment or a Gatsby or some other front end library, and you want to build out an app for a phone, whatever it happens to be. That's going to display to the users. And you don't want to use Drupal's theme for any of that. Well, you can use Drupal to expose an API such as JSON API, and you can basically let Drupal be your content management, your user management, anything data related, and then you can have a fun, interactive, modern React app or something like that that uses that API and gives you that front end experience that you might not be able to get easily with Drupal. So if you were to take that sort of approach, you're going to need a more complex environment to work on it, because React and Node and things like that aren't really going to work in your standard PHP setup. You need the additional tools added. You need multiple services. So like I said, you're going to need something for running PHP, something for running the Node stuff. You're going to need targeted tooling. So when I run a command in my Lando, I might want it to execute against Drupal and PHP only, but I also might have some commands I want specifically to run on the React or the Node side that executes things there. And Lando lets us do that as well. And then you need interconnectivity between the two. You need a hosted Drupal environment on your hosted locally, and then you need this Node environment that's a separate app, but you need the two to talk to each other. Lando can handle that for you as well, and I'll get into some of that now. Okay, so another Lando YAML snippet here. I refer to as a Lando file is the terminology commonly used to describe this file. So you have this one. It's called example Gatsby Drupal. We're going to use Gatsby as our front end environment, and Drupal as our back end. This recipe is using the Drupal 8 recipe that comes with Lando out of the box, pre-configured to run Drupal 8. Everything's great, but that doesn't come with Node, but we'll get into how we can add that. Standard config here, we're going to use, Drupal/web is our web root. 7.3 is the PHP version we're going to run, and database MariaDB 10.2. These are arbitrary, whatever you need them to be for your project, but I'm just showing that you can define those things. And then further down your Lando YAML, you'll have the services section. Now, here, App Server is a service you actually already get out of the box, as I mentioned earlier. It's the one that is going to run Drupal. It's your PHP and your Apache. What we're doing here, though, is we're saying, okay, during the build process, so under this build line, meaning when Lando is starting up for the first time and it is creating your environment and setting it up the way you need it, it will run whatever steps you define here. So we're going to, this part doesn't necessarily matter, but in this one, I am setting up platform.sh, there's CLI into the Drupal recipe. There's actually a platform.sh recipe that comes with this built in, but for this case, I wanted my own. So, and then we are going into more colorful output, this T-put thing here. And actually, I mean, post a, yes, I do have it. And that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to, Matt's asking if I have this in a repo, and I will post, actually I have the full set of links here. It's to work. So that first link that I just posted in the chat, and I'll show these for anyone watching the video later. I'll show these at the very end as well, since you won't be able to see the chat. But yeah, the very first one is examples by my XDEBUG example is there, and I intend to add any others that are missing over time here. So watch for that to continue to grow and have more examples, cool stuff. So anyway, the build process here runs, it installs our platform.sh CLI tool, and then it runs Composer. And maybe I've got a pretty big site and Composer runs for a while, so I make the, I think that by default, Composer times out after 300 seconds. I make it 600. And then I run Composer install, give it the time it needs. So this all happens while the very first time you start up Lando, when it's building your environment, and then never again unless you have to rebuild for some reason. All right. So then further down our Lando YAML file, we have an overrides section. In this overrides section, you are essentially overriding some of the Docker config. So, and this is actually still below our services section. So below services, app server, now overrides is a subsection of that. And we say, okay, we want to override the environment variables. So in this case, since I'm not using the platform.sh recipe that comes with Lando, I have defined my own project ID as an environment variable, so the Lando or the platform CLI can actually access that. And then we're also setting some things up for Drush. If you set the URL, you may have seen when you're running Drush that the URL, if you do like a Drush user login, URL says default instead of the actual URL that you want. If you set this Drush options URI environment variable to the URL to your Lando site, whenever you use Drush locally in your Lando, and anytime a URL needs to be generated, you'll get your actual URL instead of just the word default. So that could be useful. And this I'm going to touch on later. The Drupal test traits base URLs. We're going to talk about Drupal test traits some. So I will come back to this, but basically we're setting URL environment variables for that to use. Talk more about that later on. Okay, so now, still under services, no longer under app server, we're going to create a new service that is not included with the Drupal 8 recipe. We want a Node.js service, and you can name it anything you want. I called it Node.js. What matters is what type it is. I say it's Node 10. I chose Node 10 because it is the version that the cloud provider that's running my Node stuff is running, so I set it to match. Scanner false. So scanner false, if you're familiar with Lando, when you start up Lando for the first time, or anytime you start up your environment, it will run a check against all of your app's URLs and make sure they get positive responses and make sure your app's actually running. This takes a minute, and it basically runs until all of your services are up and running, and then it says, okay, hooray, your app is running. Our Node server actually doesn't run all the time. It's Gatsby, and if you've used Gatsby before, Gatsby has a development server that you just start it up when you need it. So we don't want Lando trying to ping this URL, and it'll just keep trying for a while before it eventually times out and gives up, because that slows down our startup time, and then we get a message about it not working. So we just say scan or false. It's not going to scan our URL. Once it kicks off this service, it's going to start it up, and it's not going to check to make sure that it's accessible, because it won't be. So a way to speed up that. In our instance here, we're overriding Docker's setup for ports. We're saying that we want to add port 8000, because that is Gatsby's development server, the port it uses when you access in your browser. And so what we want is port 8000 on the left says that's on the inside of our Docker container. We want that to actually come out to the outside too. We want to be able to use that on our local machine, port 8000. So that forwards it out. So I can actually go to localhost 8000, and it will, just like the Gatsby docs tell you to do when you want to access your site in development mode. And this will just let you do it. Oops. So here we have some environment variables for Gatsby. We've got the public path, basically when Gatsby runs its builds, just so it knows what the URL is as it's building things. And the Gatsby refresh endpoint, what that does is when you're using Drupal with Gatsby and you're using the Gatsby module, when you create a node or edit a node, for example, on the Drupal side, the Gatsby modules send a ping to your node server, your Gatsby server, and tell it, hey, we need to refresh, something changed. And it will actually tell your development server to kick off the new build with the new page. And that's documented in the Gatsby modules docs, but this is how you would do it in Lando. You'd put it here, and that would enable that. Okay, so further on down our Lando file, we've got some globals. Okay, so this is still inside our Node.js service we're creating. We're going to say Gatsby CLI is, so basically these are NPM packages. It comes as part of when you set up a node service in Lando, it automatically gives you this global section where it'll let you install NPM packages, node packages globally, so that they're available to everything in your container. In this case, I just say I want the Gatsby CLI, the latest version, and I want Yarn, the latest version. It installs those in the background during the build, and they're available on the command line anywhere inside. I keep accidentally scrolling. Okay, so in this case, there's something a little wonky that goes on. The node user is the user account that gets created, or that does all of the build steps. So when you're running tooling and installing things during the build, it uses the node user. I believe this bug is fixed. I actually could probably get rid of this slide, but just in case it isn't. So when everything gets created, files are created, they have the node user account. And then when you go to access these your files later on, Lando drops you in with a different username, and so you don't own any of the files that you created during your build step. And that command gets rid of the password, the user password, so you can just switch to the node user and do things as necessary. So that's a workaround for a bug that actually may not exist anymore. I'll have to look into that. The build steps on this, I just put a message here. It's colorful. I think it's either blue or green. I forget. but just says preparing Gatsby. And then what it does is it runs, changes directory into the Gatsby directory where I have all of my Gatsby files stored. And it runs yarn install. Yarn, if you're not familiar, is a lot like Composer, but for the JavaScript side. And it downloads all of your dependencies for the Gatsby side. This actually is in the wrong spot, so we'll skip right over it. The Lando YAML further down. Now we're going to get into our tooling. So we've got commands. Tooling is your commands that you define yourself. So on my host machine, if I want to enter a command into the Docker container, I can do that with Lando tooling by defining it here. So in the tooling section, I say, for example, npm. npm is another package manager for JavaScript stuff, or Node or Yarn. Basically, when I want to run those commands on my local computer, have those passed in to the Docker container, I type Lando npm or Lando Node or Lando Yarn, and right there where it says service, it passes into that Node.js service that I defined, and you get a you get that command. It just sends it whatever directory you're in. So if I want to run yarn install in the root of my Gatsby directory, I just type Lando yarn install, and it will pass that command into the Node.js container in my Gatsby directory where I'm at. Same thing, any other service. So the way these are defined, I'm not defining what they are. All I'm doing is saying these commands already exist inside my container. Pass them on through. A little more custom here is the drush command. What I'm doing, okay, I want this. Drush isn't installed on the Node.js server, so I don't want it to run there. So run on my app server where PHP and everything in Drupal lives. And I define the command. The command is what is actually going to be run. So when we're saying yarn or Gatsby, we don't need a command because it's just going to pass through yarn. That is the command. But for drush, there's some more to it. So we define the command. We say drush root. So no matter where I'm at with drush, the root will make it so that it changes directory into my app Drupal web directory. So all my drush commands actually are run against my instance of Drupal. Then we have the develop command. This is also under the tooling. This one's more custom. This is, okay, it's going to run in the Node.js. I put a description on there. So whenever you run, if you just run Lando or Lando help in your command line, the description is what gets shown next to the command. It lists all the commands that are available. So you'll see your custom develop listed and their start Gatsby development server as the description. And our command here, we're basically just saying, okay, switch to the Lando mount directory, then run yarn. So we're running yarn workspaces in this project, which is a whole another thing I'm not going to get into, but essentially lets you run multiple yarn environments inside of one. But I'm just saying, okay, I want to run the develop command in my SW environment, which is my Gatsby environment. And the key thing here is this is essentially the same as Gatsby develop if you've done this locally without yarn workspaces. This is not necessarily. They could just say Gatsby develop there and it would work just fine. But the host section at the end there, that 0.0.0.0, that tells basically tells Docker in the container that can be accessed from the outside of the container. So it opens it up to the networking. So that you can go localhost :8000 in your browser on your own machine, and it will get passed through by Lando and Docker into this instance of the development server. All right, so now we go to our build steps. No, I'm sorry, this is our build tooling still. We're still in the tooling section. So build is another custom command we're creating. So Lando build will execute a command in the Node.js container. It will start a Gatsby build. So Gatsby has a process that converts all of your code and pulls in all of your data from Drupal and builds out flat HTML files. It's the sort of the big thing with Gatsby. You get a static HTML build of your site with some React goodness put on top of that to add some performance and usability enhancements. So we want to run a build. So we just type Lando build. We get its nice colored message here. I want to say I made these blue. I think the 2 is blue. There's a number code for each color. You look up the bash colors for this set AF thing. You can set background colors. You can make the text itself whatever color. I believe 2 is blue. I don't remember. Anyway, so I get a blue message that says it's building Gatsby, and then it changes to the Lando mount directory and runs our build command, and then we'll just start getting all the output from Gatsby as it does its build. I'm going to skip this one, cover it in a minute. So this one is kind of dated now because the platform.sh integration is out for Lando. But previously, if I wanted to download the database, I would have a command like this. But it's worth keeping in here to talk about because you can use other environments. You can do something like this in other environments that don't have the built-in integration with Lando. You would just change out the code to do what you need. But in my case, I want to download the database. In this case, I used platform.sh's CLI tool and told it to execute a DB dump of my environment, give it to me as a gzip file in my Drupal app and call it this particular file name. And that just gets dropped right into my local machine's root directory, so then I can use Lando to import it. And Lando comes with that. It's Lando DB import is the command. And you say Lando DB import this file name, it'll just pop it right into your environment. But basically, any CLI tool, if you have CLI access or a CLI tool from your hosting provider that allows you to remotely execute a DB dump, you could do that here. This downloads it for us, platform.sh CLI, but other environments that I've worked in, you just throw in an rsync. So you execute whatever command that dumps the DB, and it'll now exist up on your server, and then you can do an rsync to pull it down to your local as another line, but then you have it locally. So I need to talk faster because I have more to get through and I'm not there yet. I do have 2 sessions, but I want to get done with this part of it in the first session. So DB reset, another command. This just runs all of your, this is one I've defined myself, DB reset, specifically for Drupal. It runs all of the common commands that you might want to run after you import a database into your Drupal environment. So what I'm saying here is on the database service, I want to run, there's this helper file exists inside all of the Lando containers. It's helper /SQL import.sh. It is the same script that runs when you type Lando DB import. What I'm doing is I'm calling it manually as a step within my own tooling. The SQL import sh runs, and I tell it, okay, look for any files that are sql.zip or sql.gz or mysql.gz. If you find any of those, pass them to the import script. And so that'll get imported into my database. So my previous command, I download the database dump into my root of my app, and then I run DB reset, and it will pop it into my database. It'll clear out the database that is there and replace it with my latest download. And then on my app server, now I want to run some drush commands. Fairly typical after doing an import of a database, you'd want to run the Drupal updates, run updb. And then we want to clear the caches, and then config import. If you're managing config in YAML files, you'll want to run a config import. So we update the database, make sure the schema is up to date with all the latest code changes you've made locally. We rebuild the cache so all that takes effect everywhere it needs to. We import our now latest config. And if you're using config split for different environments, I've had issues where it works better if you just run that twice. So you can get the default, and then it will get whatever split config you've got. And then we rebuild caches again as for good measure. And I like to dump a user login so once this process is done, blam, you get a link to just click and be logged into your website. So now we're going to talk about Drupal as an app. So you can take Drupal. This is sort of a concept that I just kind of thought up one day. Like Drupal typically exists as a website on a server that is constantly connected to the internet that you need to maintain and keep up to date, keep the bots off of it, and keep it secure. And you have to manage this thing. Well, what if all you have is maybe a blog that you update like 3 times a year? It's great to have Drupal so you can create that content and just publish it and be good to go. But if you're hardly touching this thing, you might be spending more time maintaining it than actually using it. So what if you could have Drupal that runs locally on your computer only when you need it? That's where I came up with this idea as an app, right? You install your Drupal app, it runs. When you're done with it, you can delete it and get rid of it. And still have your content, your blog post out there on the internet. The Tome module is a solution to this, or helps with this solution. Tome is a static site generator. It is, it basically takes your site as it looks, theme, date, content, all of it, and dumps it as flat HTML, CSS, JavaScript, just the files, no more Drupal. Pulls Drupal out of it essentially, and gives you those files that you can then just upload to any cheap web hosting, and your site is there. You just lose the ability to log in with Drupal, basically. It stores your content statically, so you don't need to keep a database up anywhere. It actually converts all of your content into JSON files, and you can store those in Git, for example, and shut down your database, and you don't need to have that persistent database anywhere. It also gives you the ability to publish to various providers. It's actually got additional modules you can get for Tome. There's one for, I believe, GitHub and GitLab and Netlify and some other places that will give you free hosting for flat files. And so rate is drush commands. You essentially build your Tome site and then publish with one of these other drush commands, and it will just push your site up to wherever it needs to be, and it's published. So an example of how that works in Lando. Another thing is with Lando, your whole environment can spin up on demand. You say Lando start, it'll build everything you need. It'll pull in Drupal. It'll pull in your Tome stuff, your flat JSON content files. It'll automatically import those into your database. So now you have a fully running Drupal just by starting Lando. And when you're done with it, you can shut it down and delete it. So example here, Drupal 8 recipe, Drupal/web is the web root. We have our app server service. One of our build commands is to run Composer. In our Composer file, we've got Tome listed as one of the dependencies, so one of our modules. So Tome will come in. We're overriding, we're saying drush options URL. Like I said earlier, this gives you the URL to the actual site locally that you want when you have drush commands. And then you can say Lando start, and it's going to install your all of your dependencies, which includes Tome, which includes Tome's dependencies. And then it will fire up your whole environment. And part of what Tome does when it gets installed, or actually, I think I cover that later. We'll wait till this. Actually, that's good enough. Okay. So once you're up and running, you have what just looks like regular Drupal, your default Drupal thing here. You can add some content just like you would. And then what Tome will do is take that node that you just created in Drupal, turn it into JSON files, and dump it into a content directory on your file system. So now you have, instead of a database, you have these files that hold all the information about the page you created. And then here we add a build command. So this is under tooling. So I'd say Lando build. And what that will do is run the drush tome static command, which is what actually builds all of your static HTML. So it'll give you something like this, and then it will output the flat files that you can now just upload to any cheap hosting or free hosting, whatever you can find, anywhere you want. It's just HTML files, basically, so anything can run it. And yeah, your index.html will be your homepage. Your in Drupal, by default, when you have a page, it's whatever your site /node/1. If it's the first page you've created, well, that node directory there is that /, and then inside there will be a file called 1.html. That'll be your page. It does work with aliases as well. So if you have aliases, it'll create folders and HTML in there. More tooling here. Install. So let's say now I'm done. I uploaded those files to wherever they're going to be hosted. Those flat JSON files, as well as my Drupal config. I've now committed that to a Git repository. It's up to GitHub, for example. And now I can just delete all local instances of everything. But now, okay, I want to get back up and running. It's been a couple months. I want to put up another post. Well, I have this tooling, so I pull down my my GitHub repository again. I say Lando start. It does that build process again. But now this time I have those JSON files because I've created content since. So I've created this Lando tooling. I say Lando install, and it will run through. It'll run Composer again, get that installed just in case there's any changes it needs to update. And then it will run drush tome install. And what that does is it goes through those JSON files and imports them all into your database. So now you have all of your content back in the database where Drupal can access it and use it. And you're back up and running in, well, depending on the size of your site, potentially a few minutes. And that's Tome. And there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with Tome. I got the link in there. Let's see, I got 3 minutes left technically. I don't think they're gonna be too mad if I run a couple minutes over. I'm right near the end here. But I've got Drupal test traits running on one of my projects, and Drupal test traits is pretty cool. So if you've messed with writing tests or running tests for Drupal, you're probably familiar with the fact that you are dealing with a fresh install of Drupal when you run your tests. So you're essentially just testing functionality of your different features from a fresh install, which is good for a module that you're sharing with everyone, and you just want to make sure the module works the way it's supposed to work on a fresh, clean Drupal site. But if you have a big site with a lot of stuff and your actual goal is to make sure that the changes that you are making are going to work with the content of your current site, you'll want to use Drupal test traits because that will actually load your Drupal database as you provide it, as it is, and actually execute tests against that actual site. Uses your database, uses your config. It's not a mystery about, what will happen once there's data here. Or more specifically, once our data is there. So just like the PHP unit tests that maybe you've run before, where you just run PHP unit and it goes through things. But you need to set it up on Lando to where it actually works. So on Lando, we're going to create a service for Chrome. So Google Chrome exists as you can get it in a headless mode. So no GUI at all, nothing to see. It just kind of runs as a command line tool and doesn't output anything for you to look at. But it can execute clicks and JavaScript and interact with your website via command line. So Drupal test traits is going to need that in order to simulate some of the interaction with the site. So on Lando, we need to set up a service that has Chrome installed. And this one, this does not come with Lando, but Lando gives us the ability to use any Docker configuration or any Docker image that we want. In this case, we're saying this is a type of compose. So it's going to use Docker Compose. Anything below is Docker Compose stuff. We're just passing it right through to Docker. We're saying our services, our image, that's this Chrome headless stable. That's an image out there on the internet. We're going to download it by defining it there. The command that is run when Lando starts is this command. So Lando's going to start. We're going to say exec Google Chrome, put it in headless mode, disable the GPU, remote debugging address. Again, that 0.0.0.0 passes the stuff from the inside of the container out to where Docker's networking thing could then pass it out to your host machine. And then we set our remote debugging port. And then here we say our ports, 922, 922. That means the port inside the container needs to also be mapped to the port on our host machine. So now we can localhost 9222, and we'll have access to the debug data in Chrome. And then here we have test tooling. So under your tooling, you have this test command. You say, okay, I'm going to run on the app server service, and the command's going to run. I give you a nice little colorful message, running PHP tests, and then it goes and runs PHP unit with, in this case, we've set up some configuration, which actually, I'll post the links again here in a minute, but in the Drupal test traits links, they tell you I set up that PHP unit XML file so that it works. It tells PHP unit what to do and how to access things. And so now you just type Lando test, and PHP unit will run against your fully built out, loaded up instance of your site inside Lando. And it'll output all its results. And I believe, and that's it. Okay, so here I'm just talking and just showing that you can go to my Lando examples Git repository and pull in most of what we talked about, I believe. I'll get that updated so that everything's in there. I'll paste those here again in the chat. And then I will post them here for video watchers. So yeah, does anyone have any questions? That concludes part one here. Part two, we're going to get into the more stuff you can do in the cloud. You can run tests in your CI environments. You can interact with different services through command line tools and kick off merges or kick off deployments from within Lando. We'll cover all that after lunch. So if you want to see some more advanced stuff, if you thought I wasn't a terrible speaker and you just want to hear me speak some more, that's fine too. See you then. But yeah, any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.